Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. This week in Illinois in Focus, we'll discuss a new report on the state's economic performance that places Illinois in the bottom 5 of the U.S. We'll also discuss the heavily criticized Illinois Homeschool Act and its prospects for passing this session. And we'll analyze the Chicago Teachers Union new contract with Chicago Public Schools. All that and more when we return.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. The American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, released its annual Rich States, Poor States report this week. Illinois ranked 46th out of 50 states for economic outlook and 47th out of the 50 in economic performance the past 10 years. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square Illinois reporter, Jim Talamani. Jim, you reported on this new analysis from ALEC this week. Why did Illinois fare so poorly?
Well, it's unfortunately, the economists who put together this report have been studying this for quite some time. This is the 18th year that the ALEC-Laffer Competitiveness Index has come out. And one of the three primary report authors, Jonathan Williams, said, well, Illinois has been near the bottom most of the last decade. And he said the state is becoming poorer and losing residents. We've heard that from some people locally. But here we're talking about economists and including a couple of nationally recognized people involved in putting this together, and Stephen Moore and Art Laffer. And Williams did note that because there weren't, direct property tax increases in the last budget or two, that probably helped us a little bit, and keeping the income tax flat, which there were proposals to unflatten the income tax, that helped Illinois. And so we actually had a slightly better economic outlook than performance. In terms of performance, 47th out of 50, that measures over the last decade. And, but Williams noted that when you look at states around us, most of the Midwest has become very competitive. And so most of these states are moving up. We saw Indiana with number 3 in the nation out of 50 in terms of outlook. So a big gain there. And Williams tracked that to their changes in policies that go back, really started when Mitch Daniels was governor. He's now head of Purdue University, where he's had some success. So, Wisconsin gains there. Once again, I just read on the Center Square this week, budget surplus again in Wisconsin. It seems to be a trend that's going back now, about a decade or so, that Wisconsin has had improvements in terms of budget situations, when that wasn't always the case when these ALEC reports were first beginning. Ohio with some gains, Kentucky, Missouri. Williams said Illinois and to a lesser degree Minnesota are the outliers, but Illinois is near the bottom, and he said becoming poorer and losing residents. So there's just not a lot to look for in terms of improvement right now in terms of policies. I guess the less bad in a few areas is the only thing that probably kept us from dropping even closer to rock bottom.
Yeah, just looking at that report here, Jim, it's interesting to see who fares well in the report and who doesn't fare so well. The only 4 states trail Illinois in the outlook rankings. And you might notice a trend of those states behind Illinois. Illinois is 46th for forward-looking economic outlook. California is 47th. New Jersey is 48th. Vermont is 49th. And New York State is 50th. All blue states with blue governors, blue legislatures. Now we should say here that ALEC is a fiscally conservative outlook, but they use, as you mentioned, these many different economic indicators and tax references to come up with its report. Did it give any suggestions on how Illinois could improve its standing, or only by looking at how the states that did better?
Well, one of the things Williams pointed out, and I thought this was very interesting, that state tax burden, tax rates, of course, and we know that Illinois is very high in those areas. Governor Pritzker might say, well, we're labor friendly and we're friendly to workers, so that makes us more attractive in Indiana. Kevin Bessler just wrote an interesting story yesterday about Indiana making moves to change the boundary because there are counties, quite a few counties in Illinois that have voted to secede from Illinois. Now it's very, very difficult, almost impossible for that to happen. But the fact that there's so much willingness to leave, to go across to another state, and it tells you something maybe isn't right here. So, but an interesting William said is that sometimes when the tax burdens get too high and tax rates get too high, the state will then try to compete in a different way. I'm quoting Williams, by giving away special favors to politically connected entities. And this makes me think to two different things that we've covered quite a bit of in the last 6 months or so. One was the trial of Michael Madigan,
right,
the former Illinois House Speaker, and payments to ComEd, which originally he was antagonistic toward ComEd, and then when ComEd started hiring his allies as subcontractors for little or no work, then ComEd started getting beneficial legislation passed. And we saw Madigan convicted on 10 corruption counts, and a number of those were related to the ComEd situation. Another thing I think of that's no charges, no illegalities have been connected with any of this very early stage, but Governor Pritzker is very much into the quantum business, quantum computing. Now, again, there's nothing. This is an exciting field. The technology could be potentially incredible, but Illinois has given a lot of tax incentives and tax breaks to multi-million-dollar quantum companies. We're not talking about little businesses that are, small tech startups with 2 or 3 guys in a tiny office. No, these are multi-million-dollar companies, or in some cases, PsiQuantum multi-billion-dollar companies that are getting hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks from state of Illinois taxpayers. And so that's one of the favored businesses. And so sometimes people say, oh, government picking winners and losers, that's a partisan argument. But according to Williams and the economists behind the Owl report, this is something states do when the tax burden's so high. They're so desperate to bring businesses in when the out-migration of businesses is great. So to counter that, we get these special breaks. So, you look at that PsiQuantum campus, and I talked with some Southeast Chicago residents. This is not a wealthy neighborhood at all. And they're concerned that people are going to come into this campus, go in, everything will be for them there. They'll leave. There will be no benefit to the little businesses in that neighborhood, which has struggled economically since steel mills closed in the 70s and 80s. So, Jose opens a taco stand, a mile away or a half a mile from this quantum. He gets no benefit. He gets no tax break. He's got to pay high property taxes in part to cover tax breaks because so many multi-million-dollar companies get these breaks. And it's something that a lot of people on both sides of the aisle don't care for when really wealthy companies get these tax breaks. And so we kind of see evidence of that here in Illinois.
You and I didn't get any tax breaks.
No, I don't think so. I wish.
Yeah, right.
I just sent in my big check the other day. So
property taxes second high. Yeah, with income taxes, of course. Property taxes second highest in the country, among the highest sales taxes in the country. And then you've got all these other fees. Well, the gas tax is the second highest.
Yeah, you're right about fees. In the governor's budget, there are fee increases and a lot of legislation out there that, we're not raising taxes, but, court document fees, different kinds of registration fees, different kinds of document fees. Some of these are going up dramatically. And it's maybe more of a minor part of some of the, House and Senate committee hearings at the Illinois Capitol, but it's happening, and it doesn't draw big headlines, but these numbers add up. They make the cost of living go up. And what happens when cost of living gets too high? Well, people go somewhere where it's not quite so expensive. And so out-migration, and that's another thing William said. It's hard to hide from out-migration. And that we know here in Illinois has been a story for years now.
Yeah, 9 years consecutive until last year. And the only reason why the population didn't shrink last year, according to the U.S. Census, was because of international migration. having to do with the daily crisis under President Biden and Texas governor's Greg Abbott's busing plan. Texas got hit the worst by the border crisis. Greg Abbott started busing migrants from his state up to sanctuary states such as Illinois, particularly Chicago. Anyway, just to close out this topic, Jim, we mentioned the low-ranking states. We talked about Illinois. At the top of the list was Utah, Tennessee. You referenced the Illinois neighbor, Indiana, number 3, North Carolina, and North Dakota.
Yeah, Utah. Jonathan Williams was actually in Utah for the big announcement there that they were number 1 for economic outlook. And so a lot of people might have been thinking, Florida, Texas. Florida wasn't so high in outlook, but Florida was number 1 for economic performance. So that's over the last decade. And again, Ron DeSantis, the governor there, gets a lot of often seen very partisan and is criticized, but in terms of fiscal policy and economic policy, and certainly disaster preparedness, that kind of thing, he's received very high marks in those areas.
Thank you for that, Jim. Let's move on now. The Homeschool Act, very controversial, particularly among homeschool parents, because it would place stricter regulations on parents who homeschool their children rather than sending them to a public school or a private school. It did not make it out of the House when it by the deadline this past Friday, what's called crossover day. There was a deadline for bills to move from the House to the Senate and vice versa. That does not mean this bill is dead by any means, because Illinois lawmakers have plenty of tricks that they use to bring what was thought to be dead legislation back to life. But anyway, it didn't pass the House. Homeschool parents protested the proposed legislation both in Springfield and in Chicago recently. What do you think is going to happen with that?
Well, that's a great question, because I think you're right. This isn't dead. The bill sponsor, Tara Costa Howard, took this. You could tell she took this very personally. And when she made her speech on the House floor to say she wasn't going to call it for a vote, that it was going to be held, she was not happy, and she took some shots at the opponents. Who would have thought back when the session started in January that this would have been the most controversial bill at the State House? I mean, what ostensibly at first glance appears to cover a small segment of the population, right? Homeschool families. But it turns out the legislation doesn't only cover a small segment of the population. Now, there was a big rally in Springfield and a massive one in Chicago's Daley Plaza, where it appeared most of the people there were homeschool families and advocates. However, the legislation also would have put some heavy burdens on non-public schools and public school districts. Non-public schools there would be documentation and forms to fill out for the government, penalties if they weren't addressed. So in talking with Bob Gilligan from the Catholic Conference of Illinois, he said, well, this is going to cost us money. We have to submit all this paperwork, and we don't really think that, if the government wants parents' information, families' information, they should get it from the families, not with us. They shouldn't put us in the middle of this. We're just here to educate the kids. And then public school districts would be charged with handling all this paperwork from homeschool families. And this is one other reason I think this isn't dead, is because the fiscal note attached to this bill stated that the costs are unknown to local school districts with this legislation. And there was a recommendation that the bill sponsors have further discussion about this. Well, the fiscal note was dropped from this somehow after the legislation was held. And so that, this is something that I think perhaps Tara Costa Howard, the state rep from Glen Ellen, perhaps said, well, this is going to be a problem if public school districts all of a sudden realize that this is going to cost us money, this bill to deal with homeschool families. Well, we're already, a lot of school districts around the state, are really struggling to cover their expenses in an era of inflation. And especially Chicago Public Schools is deeply in the red, all kinds of problems. The new contract, they don't know how they're going to fund it with the Chicago Teachers Union, which we'll get to. So if you add more costs to handle paperwork with homeschool families and then report those as truant who don't turn in their paperwork, I mean, this takes again, someone in a school who should be involved with taking care of children and educating children. Now they're dealing with paperwork to deal with state government and homeschool families who don't even want to be involved with the public schools. So a lot of stuff in this bill that would affect a lot of people. And it's one of those pieces of legislation, again, that it at first glance looks narrow, but it really isn't. It has a lot of impact. But again, given the bill sponsor's reaction, I think she's going to try to find a way to keep this alive, because she was pretty upset that it got shot down.
Yeah, Republicans have for years criticized Democrats for passing these mandates that on school districts that don't come with any funding. As a matter of fact, Jim, sort of a side note here, but find it interesting because it's a similar topic. I just added a story today that there's a bill making its way through the legislature that would require schools to test for and mitigate radon every 4 years. That would come at a cost of tens of thousands of dollars for those schools, but the state wasn't going to provide any funding for that. The local schools were going to have to figure out how to eat that themselves. Anyway, sorry for the distraction on that. So we'll see if this bill comes back in another form. Legislators are off this week, return next week, and go until the end of May. As we've said, Illinois lawmakers are full of all kinds of tricks, and I wouldn't be surprised if this gets some new life. Now, speaking of schools, let's talk about the largest school district in the state of Illinois by far, Chicago Public Schools. They and the Chicago Teachers Union announced this week an agreement on a contract. You covered it, Jim. You're right there in Chicago.
If you're looking for a raise, you can work in a Chicago public school. It's not an easy job, not suggesting that at all, but the new contract for the Chicago Teachers Union struck with Chicago Public Schools, 4-year deal. By the end of it, the average teacher's base salary will be more than $114,000 a year. This is for a school year that's under 10 months. You take out Thanksgiving week, which is a full week off in Chicago Public Schools, 2 weeks of Christmas and a week in spring. You're really looking at a job that's 9 months a year. And of course, there are additional opportunities to add to these income levels through tutoring and coaching and other kinds of opportunities. What's remarkable to me is that, there's been some strife among the Chicago Teachers Union. There's some, I don't know if we call them cliques or groups. There's the core group that's very strongly behind CTU President Stacey Davis Gates, longtime ally of Mayor Brandon Johnson, definitely a political activist to say the least. There's a group that's even left of that. And then there's another group that's very moderate. But boy, in terms of this vote, everyone coalesced in terms of CTU members. 97% of those who voted in favor of this contract. Well, why not when you get these kinds of raises? Largest raise in a number of contracts, more than a decade. And this is for a group that normally gets better raises than the average person in the private sector. And it's another remarkable thing about the vote that was conducted, a little over a week ago. Results were announced Monday. 85% CTU member participation, 85% turnout. Imagine what this country might look like if we had 85% turnout in a presidential election, let alone your local elections. And this is an election that kind of buried the lead when I wrote the story, but those who were casting a vote, anyone who cast a ballot, had to show state-issued ID and proof of union membership. So, you had to have both your state-issued ID and either your union card or a proof of dues payment. So apparently this didn't suppress many voters, because 85% turnout in the Chicago Teachers Union is remarkable. And then 97% in favor, really a remarkable deal. No wonder CTU calls it a landmark deal.
Of course, you're referencing the no voter ID law when you come to actual elections, and when you're electing politicians to sit in government. No voter ID laws. Democrats in the state have said that is voter suppression if you require an ID.
It seems like common sense. If you're holding a union election, you can't have anybody walking in off the street voting, right? Well, but remarkable turnout, remarkable. And the numbers, we touched on the salary numbers, but talked with Miley Smith, the Illinois Policy Institute. She said this is a $1.5 billion deal to be taken on by the taxpayers in a city which is already in the red. Credit ratings dropped, and potentially dropping further. And the one step left for this to be official is for the Board of Education to approve. They're expected to approve. That's, I believe, on the 24th.
And that's that's the same board that Mayor Johnson self-appointed, right?
He self-appointed several new members, ditched the old members, brought it. But then in the elections, his candidates, most of them lost, but he only needed to win 2 or 3, and he got 3 or 4 to maintain the majority to, so that his, things that he's in favor of are almost certainly going to go through with this board. But once board approval happens, CPS CEO Pedro Martinez, who's on his way out at the end of the school year, he said, then we have to file an amendment or pass a resolution. I don't know the language he used exactly, but we have to, we need an amendment to fund the first year of the contract. Forget about the next 3. He said, yes, the board would have to pass an amendment to fund the first year of the deal. So it's not, this $1.5 billion deal is not funded. So where is the money going to come from? Well, probably looking at him here, Chicago taxpayer.
Yeah, right. Good luck, Jim.
Yeah.
Let's move on, but stick with Chicago. At the Chicago City Council meeting this week, Jim, Alderman considered a proposal to make changes to the teen curfew that's in place. It was an interesting meeting. I think you covered it. Tell us a little bit more about it.
It was. And there wasn't as much debate on this as I expected there to be. There was one speaker from the Streeterville area. That's just north of downtown. It's if you're going to Navy Pier, you pass right through it, just kind of east of Michigan Avenue, heading toward the lake. A lot of high rises, a lot of commercial, that kind of thing. So an alderman who has part of that area, Alderman Brian Hopkins, he wanted to move the teen curfew. Unaccompanied minors aren't supposed to be out alone after 10 p.m. Well, he wanted that to be 8 p.m. in the Streeterville area because last month there were 2 shootings. There were large, quote unquote, teen gatherings. Some might call them youth mobs, and there were altercations. There were streets blocked. There were people jumping on cars, and 2 people were injured in shootings. And then there was banging on doors. I mean, it was a somewhat of a scary scene. And so we need to do something about this. We can't just have, this area. Well, some of the opponents in the city council and the mayor even said, well, if we do specific to a certain neighborhood, that's just going to push the problem to a different area. And so Hopkins revised his proposal, and he, to his credit, he consulted with Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling, met with him, and what they called a compromise deal would be that this Hopkins would not continue with this, but instead a replacement ordinance would allow police the ability to call an emergency curfew at any hour or at any location in the city. I haven't heard yet, but I have to believe there's going to be some real opposition to this from the anti-police groups, of which there are several in Chicago that are quite vocal. But according to Hopkins, he had enough votes to pass that ordinance. So once he gets that out of committee, I would think at the next council meeting, that will come up for a vote. And if he still has those 30 votes, if the votes don't change, which they could, again, lobbyist pressure, that kind of thing. But this was a deal that a lot of even the mayor said this is an improvement. He said this is a step in the right direction, and this is collaboration. And so we'll see where it goes. But Streeterville residents were up in arms about seeing their neighborhood become.
Well, I can imagine.
Even though the governor and the mayor are talking about violence numbers being down, these incidents are still going on, and residents are not happy.
Keep your head down, Jim. But thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.